When Italian POWs were sent to a California shipyard, they expected a barbed wire cage. What they found were women, not nurses, not secretaries, but bosses. Women welding steel, riveting hulls, and giving them orders. The war had prepared them for enemies, but it had not prepared them for Rosie the Riveter. The air inside the truck was thick with the smell of diesel, sweat, and stale fear. For 24-year-old Enzo Bianchi, every lurch and rumble of the engine was a drumbeat toward an unknown, terrifying fate. He was a prisoner of war, captured in the dust and heat of North Africa. And now, after an endless journey across an ocean, he was somewhere deep in the enemy's homeland, America. Back in his village in Sicily, the posters had shown the Americans as monsters, gangsters with machines, and godless people who valued nothing but money and power. The radio broadcasts had warned that captured Italian soldiers would be sent to desolate camps, forced into brutal labor until they perished from exhaustion. He clutched the small wooden cross his mother had given him, its edges worn smooth. He expected barbed wire. He expected a barren desert. He expected the worst of humanity. The truck's brakes hissed, and it shuddered to a halt. The men around him tensed, their faces pale in the gloom. They heard the heavy footsteps of guards outside, the metallic scrape of bolts being undone. This was it. The canvas flap was thrown back, and the sudden blinding light made Enzo cry out, shielding his eyes. A voice shouted, not in anger, but as a simple command. "All right, andiamo. Out. Move." Enzo stumbled from the darkness, his legs stiff, bracing for a blow for the sight of a sun-baked prison yard. Instead, he was hit by a cool, clean wind that smelled of salt and open water. He lowered his hand and froze. It was not a desert. It was not a cage. Before him lay a vast, shimmering bay of the deepest blue sparkling under a bright morning sun. Across the water, a city of bright white buildings climbed steep, rolling hills. And to his left, rising from the fog like a colossal Roman gate, was a bridge. It was painted a shocking, beautiful orange red, its towers so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. Gulls wheeled and cried overhead. Small boats bobbed on the waves. Enzo looked at the other prisoners, their expressions mirroring his own profound, speechless confusion. This place, this Sausalito, was not the cage of wire and cruelty he had been promised. It was, impossibly, the most beautiful place he had ever seen. He had been brought to a land of impossible machines and endless skies, not to be punished, but for something else entirely. He was about to discover that the bridge was not the most shocking thing America had to show him, because he wasn't being sent to a prison. He was being sent to work. Enzo was caught in a massive, quiet shift in global strategy. In September of 1943, Italy had officially surrendered to the Allies. The fascist government had collapsed, and Enzo's homeland was now technically a co-belligerent fighting alongside the Americans against Nazi Germany. This created a complex and delicate problem for the United States military. What to do with nearly 50,000 Italian prisoners already being held on American soil? They were no longer truly the enemy, but they were not yet allies. The solution was one of the most remarkable and least known programs of the Second World War. It was a gamble on human nature. The prisoners were given a choice. They could remain behind the barbed wire of traditional camps, treated as standard prisoners of war under the strict rules of the Geneva Conventions. Or they could sign a simple pledge. They could volunteer to join an Italian service unit. By signing, they became cooperators. They swore they would not attempt to escape and agreed to aid the United States war effort in any non-combat role. In exchange, the entire nature of their captivity was transformed. The armed guards vanished. The watchtowers and wire fences were replaced by open-air barracks and a level of freedom that was unthinkable just weeks before. This was not an act of simple kindness. It was an act of razor-sharp American pragmatism. The United States was fighting a two-ocean war, and millions of its youngest, strongest men were thousands of miles from home. The home front was experiencing a severe labor shortage. Farms needed harvesting, depots needed loading, and, most critically, ships needed building. These 50,000 Italians were a ready, skilled, and available workforce. And so, Enzo Bianchi was not marched to a cell. He was marched toward the thunderous noise of the Marinship shipyard. This was not a quiet harbor. It was a city of relentless, organized creation, operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, dedicated to a single purpose: building the massive Liberty ships and tankers that formed the lifeline to Europe and the Pacific. The air was filled with the rhythmic crash of pneumatic hammers, the shriek of cranes, and the white-hot hiss of welding torches. The sheer scale of the operation was beyond anything Enzo had ever imagined. The giant skeletons of the ships, rising like steel cathedrals, held him in stunned silence. But it wasn't the giant hulls or the towering cranes that truly stunned him. It was the builders themselves, moving with a confident, almost fierce energy through the organized chaos, many of them wearing trousers, wielding tools, and shouting orders with an authority he found utterly impossible. They were women. In Enzo's world, in the Italy he knew, women belonged in the home. They tended children, cooked meals, and maintained the household with quiet dignity. They certainly did not operate massive machinery, hoist steel beams, or sweat alongside men in a grimy industrial yard. Yet here, everywhere he looked, were these Rosies. They wore sturdy overalls, their hair often tied back in colorful bandanas smudged with grease and soot. They moved with a purpose, their laughter echoing above the din, their movements efficient and powerful. Enzo watched, mesmerized, as a woman effortlessly guided a welding torch, the bright flare briefly illuminating her determined face. Another, perched high on a girder, directed a crane operator with a series of sharp, decisive hand signals. He saw women driving forklifts, women riveting plates, women carrying heavy tools with a casual strength that defied every expectation. He held. A woman with fiery red hair, her face smudged but her eyes sharp, stopped in front of Enzo's bewildered group. She was perhaps 26, a few years older than Enzo, and radiated an aura of no-nonsense competence. Her sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong, capable arms. This was Maggie O'Connell, a foreman on the night shift, and to her, Enzo and his fellow Italians were simply the new hands promised by the War Manpower Commission. She didn't see former enemies. She saw a solution to her labor shortage. "All right, boys," she called out, her voice surprisingly clear over the roar of the yard. "Welcome to Marinship. You look a little lost, but that's normal. We'll get you sorted." She gestured with a wrench toward a section of a half-built Liberty ship. "You're with me. We're on hull number 2. Today you're learning to move plates. Get ready to sweat." Enzo, still grappling with the sight of a woman in charge, could only nod mutely. He had braced himself for shouts, for suspicion, for harsh commands. Instead, he was met with a practical, almost casual directive from a woman who seemed more concerned with the ship's schedule than his nationality. The propaganda had painted Americans as savage and cruel. It had failed to mention they let women build their war. He was a prisoner, an enemy. Yet he was being put to work by a woman in overalls, building a ship for the very nation he had fought against. A powerful sense of bewilderment, mixed with a strange, nascent curiosity, began to take root. Back in the fascist army, Enzo had been fed on propaganda and thin soup, a meager ration designed merely to keep a man on his feet. In the American shipyard, after his first morning of hauling steel plates, a loud whistle blew, and he was confronted with his next psychological shock. It was time for lunch. The work crews moved in a single, unhurried wave toward a long, low building. Enzo and his fellow Italians followed, hanging back, their muscles aching, expecting to be led to a separate, guarded mess. They assumed they would be given scraps, whatever was left after the real workers had eaten, but their foreman, Maggie, just waved them into the same line as everyone else. "Get a tray," she called out over her shoulder, "and try the stew. It's better than yesterday's." The canteen was a vast, noisy hall, buzzing with conversation and the clatter of silverware. The air smelled not of boiled cabbage and desperation, but of rich, roasting meat and strong coffee. Enzo watched, baffled, as the Rosies ahead of him, their faces streaked with grime, were handed heavy plates. When his turn came, he hesitantly slid his tray along the metal rail. A woman in a white apron, without even looking up, ladled a heavy scoop of beef stew onto his plate, thick with potatoes, carrots, and chunks of meat. She added 2 slices of soft white bread, a pat of real butter, and a bright red apple. At the end, another server handed him a steaming mug of black coffee. Enzo stood frozen for a moment, staring at the tray. It was a feast. It was more food, and a higher quality of food than he had eaten in over a year, even as a soldier in his own army. He found a table with the other Italians. A man across from him, Bruno, a hard-line loyalist from Rome, sneered. "It is a trick," Bruno whispered. "They fatten us like pigs before the end." But hunger quickly won out. Enzo took a bite of the stew. It was hot and it was delicious. He looked over his shoulder. 2 tables away, Maggie and her team of female welders were sitting, laughing, and eating the exact same meal. There was no separation, no special prisoner ration. Later that afternoon, another man, this one in a clean shirt and tie, approached their work area with a clipboard and a small cash box. He called Enzo's name. Puzzled, Enzo stepped forward. The man consulted his ledger and handed him 80 cents. His pay for the day, the standard wage for all Italian cooperators. Enzo held the coins in his palm, the metal warm and solid. They were feeding him like a worker, and now they were paying him like one. This was not the humiliation he had been braced for. This was dignity. He wasn't a slave. He was an employee. But as he pocketed the coins, he saw Bruno watching him, his eyes cold and full of judgment. For the first week, Enzo and his men worked in a fog of cautious silence, with Bruno's skeptical gaze following his every move. They kept their heads down, hauled the steel, and collected their pay, still half convinced this elaborate, kind-spirited workplace was some kind of trick. The American women worked around them, their voices loud and confident, but the 2 groups were like oil and water, separated by an invisible wall of language and history. The Italians were the cooperators. The Rosies were the foremen. One side was vanquished, the other victorious. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the ground shook. It began with a high-pitched shriek of metal under unbearable strain, a sound that cut through the rhythmic hammering of the yard. Enzo, a former mechanic, knew that sound. It was the sound of failure. High above, a crane was lowering a massive, prefabricated bulkhead. One of the main guide cables, frayed from the relentless schedule, had finally given way. The cable snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The massive steel plate did not fall. It swung, pivoting on its one remaining chain like a giant metal pendulum aimed directly at the ground crew. Maggie, his foreman, was directly in its path. She had been on the ground, marking the placement with chalk, her back to the danger. She heard the shouts and turned, her eyes widening, but she was trapped. She froze. Enzo didn't think. He didn't see an American, an enemy, or a boss. He saw a person in peril. He grabbed a long, heavy iron pry bar from a nearby cart. As the plate swung toward her, he ran forward. He jammed the pry bar deep into the packed earth at an angle, right where the plate's lower edge would strike. The steel plate slammed into the iron bar. The bar bent instantly into a U shape, but it held just long enough. It deflected the plate's trajectory, steering it just enough to the left. The massive wall of steel scraped past Maggie with only inches to spare, crashing into the welding gear behind her. Dust filled the air. The entire section of the yard went silent. Enzo was breathing heavily, his knuckles white on the bent bar. Maggie was on the ground, pale and covered in dust, but unharmed. She looked at the twisted metal that would have struck her. Then she looked at Enzo. He just nodded, his chest heaving, and offered a hand to help her up. She took it. "Good reflexes," she said, her voice a little shaky. But as Enzo turned back to his station, Bruno grabbed his arm. "What are you doing, fool?" Bruno hissed in Italian. "She is the enemy. Let the steel do its work." Enzo pulled his arm away, his face hardening. He felt the eyes of the other Rosies on him. They were no longer looked upon with suspicion or pity. They were looks of profound respect. After the incident with the snapped cable, the air in the yard changed. The invisible wall between the cooperators and the Rosies did not vanish overnight, but it had been breached. The shipyard, Enzo realized, was a great equalizer. It was a place of relentless, thunderous noise, of scorching metal and biting wind. It did not care about flags or politics or the languages spoken in Sicily or San Francisco. It only cared about one thing, the launch schedule. The ships had to be built. The war had to be supplied, and in that relentless 24-hour-a-day mission, a new identity was forged. You were no longer just an Italian or an American. You were a welder, a riveter, a mechanic, a rigger. You were simply a shipbuilder. The Rosies and the Italian POWs were all just tired, dirty, and united by the same coating of grease and the same ache in their backs. The small moments of connection began to multiply. Enzo, with his mechanic's eye, saw one of the women struggling with a jammed pneumatic hammer. He didn't ask. He just gestured. She, recognizing his quiet competence, handed it over. He cleared the mechanism in less than a minute and handed it back. She gave him a sharp, appreciative nod. "Good," she said. He replied with one of the few English words he knew. "Okay." A week later, Enzo saw an older American worker sharing a cigarette with one of the Italian prisoners, both of them leaning against a bulkhead, communicating in a strange pantomime. A new language was being born, a hybrid of necessity. A Rosie, needing a tool, would point and learn the Italian word martello. An Italian, warning of a hot surface, would yell the English word hot. It was a clumsy, unbeautiful language, but it was their language. It was the language of the yard, though some, like Bruno, refused to speak it, looking on with silent contempt. Maggie, his foreman, now treated Enzo less like a prisoner and more like a skilled assistant. She would point to a blueprint, and he would understand, translating her gestures into rapid Italian for his men. It was not friendship, not yet. It was something just as powerful, professional respect. The propaganda that had painted them as monsters felt like a distant, absurd dream. The walls of suspicion built by years of war were being quietly dismantled. But this new respect was about to be tested, not by the noise of the yard, but by the sounds of home. The sound of the shipyard was a deafening, relentless chorus of steel on steel, a rhythm of creation that hammered itself into your bones. But one day, during the 30-minute lunch break, a new sound cut through the roar. It was quiet at first. One of the older Italian prisoners, a man from Naples named Paolo, who rarely spoke, had closed his eyes as he ate his apple. And then he began to sing. It was not a boisterous song, but a mournful, haunting aria, a piece of an opera Enzo had heard his grandfather hum. The melody rose and fell with a powerful, heartbreaking beauty, a sound of longing for a lost world, for vineyards and village squares. The noisy chatter of the canteen slowly faded. The American women, the Rosies at the next table, stopped their own loud conversations. They turned, forks halfway to their mouths, their faces curious. They couldn't understand a single word of Italian, but the emotion was universal. It was a sound of profound homesickness. When Paolo finished, the last note hanging in the dusty air, the hall was silent for a beat. Then, one of the women, a welder with kind eyes, began to clap softly. Others joined in, a ripple of quiet applause. Bruno scoffed. "He sings for them now, like a trained monkey." Enzo ignored him. The next day, that same welder brought something new to the lunch table. It was a small, square, portable radio. She fiddled with the dial, and suddenly the canteen was filled with a completely different sound, a blast of brass, a driving, energetic rhythm, a joyful noise that seemed to defy gravity. It was Glenn Miller. The American women instantly brightened. Now it was the Italians' turn to be baffled. This wasn't music, it was chaos. It was frantic and loud. A Rosie laughed at their expressions. "What's wrong?" she shouted over the music. "It's swing! You dance to it!" Bruno made a gesture of disgust. "Degenerate noise!" Enzo just shook his head, a small smile on his face. He didn't understand their music, and they didn't understand his. But as he watched them tap their feet to the brassy rhythm, he realized it didn't matter. In that moment, they were no longer victors and vanquished. They were just people in a noisy room sharing the strange and beautiful sounds of the homes they were all, in their own ways, fighting for. That night, when Enzo was finally given a single sheet of official camp stationery to write home, he sat on his bunk and stared at it for nearly an hour. The bunkhouse was quiet except for the scratching of pencils and the heavy sighs of men trying to bridge an impossible gap with words. How could he possibly explain the truth? How could he describe this place, this life, in a way his mother in Sicily would ever believe? He dipped his pencil, the lead blunt. "Dearest Mama," he began, "I am alive, and I am well. You must not worry. I am not in a cage." He paused. "I am working. They have sent me to a place by the sea, under a giant red bridge. We are building great cargo ships." He knew this alone would baffle her, but then came the harder part. "They feed us, Mama. You would not believe the food. Every day meat in a stew and white bread and coffee. We are even paid for our work." He could almost see her face, her brows furrowed in suspicion. "Mama," he wrote, then paused again, searching for the words. "The people here, the women, they are not like our women. They work alongside us. They wear overalls like men, and they are covered in grease. My own foreman, the person who gives me my orders, is a woman named Maggie. She is young, and she is in charge, and all the men, they do as she says." He read the words back. His mother would take this letter to the village priest. They would conclude he had lost his mind. "You are writing lies," a voice said. Enzo looked up. Bruno was standing by his bunk, his shadow long in the dim light. "You are writing propaganda for them." "I am writing what I see," Enzo said, his voice low, not looking up from the paper. "You see what you want to see," Bruno replied. "You have forgotten who you are." Enzo looked at the letter, at the words he had written. "No," he said quietly. "I am finally remembering." He had seen a new world, and it had changed him in ways his old world could no longer understand. In the spring of 1944, the SS William Carruth was ready. It sat on the way, a gray steel mountain, a silent monument built by enemies and strangers. For months, its hull had been the single focus of their lives, the place where Italian prisoners and American Rosies had learned to speak the same language of work. Now, it was time. The entire yard fell quiet, a crowd of thousands, executives in suits, welders in their overalls, and the men of the Italian service unit, all holding their breath. High on the bow, a woman in a floral dress swung a champagne bottle. It shattered, and a moment later, a deafening horn blasted across the water. For a heart-stopping second, the massive ship remained perfectly still, defiant. Then, with a deep groan that shook the ground, it began to move. It slid slowly at first, then gathered speed, a building in motion, rushing down the greased ways toward the bay. The crowd erupted. Whistles and horns shrieked, and a wave of pure, unadulterated joy washed over the thousands of onlookers. The Carruth hit the water with a triumphant splash, sending a high wave rolling back, and then it was floating. It was perfect. Enzo found himself shouting, his voice raw, a wide, unconscious grin on his face. He was cheering for an American warship, and he felt nothing but a profound, powerful pride. He looked at his fellow Italians. They were clapping each other on the back, their faces lit with the same joy. He saw the Rosies jumping up and down, hugging each other, tears of exhaustion and happiness streaming through the grime on their faces. Through the happy chaos, Enzo caught Maggie's eye. She was standing on a crate, her face smudged with grease as always, her hair escaping its bandana. She wasn't holding champagne, she was holding her battered tin mug of coffee. She saw him and broke into a rare, wide smile. She raised the mug high in the air, a toast just for him. "Good work, Enzo," she shouted over the din. He nodded, raising his own hand in return. In that moment, they were not victor and vanquished, not captive and foreman. They were simply shipbuilders. Their shared creation was now floating, ready to join the war. And when the war in Europe finally ended, the Italians were sent home back to a world they no longer knew. But for Enzo Bianchi, the thunderous roar of the shipyard and the sharp, clean smell of the salt air never truly left him. He was repatriated in 1946. He stepped off a crowded ship not into the bright, confident America he had left, but into a broken Italy. His city was a landscape of ruins, its people thin and tired, its future a gray, uncertain fog. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the Marinship yard felt like a dream from another life. He told his family about his time in California, about the food, the pay, and the women in trousers who wielded welding torches. They listened, but they could not understand. It was a fairy tale. In the hunger and desperation of post-war Italy, the memory of Sausalito was more than a memory. It was a beacon. It was the place where he, a prisoner, had been treated with dignity. It was the place where he had been fed, paid, and respected for his work. He was not the only one. Thousands of former cooperators scattered across the Italian peninsula carried that same impossible memory. They had seen, firsthand, a different way of life. They had seen a nation so rich in resources and confidence that it could afford to be decent to its enemies. For many, the pull of that world, the promise of that giant red-orange bridge was too strong to ignore. It is 1955. The roar of the shipyard is long gone, replaced by the gentle clinking of masts from the sailboats that now fill the harbor. A small, bright cafe sits on the Sausalito waterfront, the air inside rich with the smell of fresh bread and strong espresso. Behind the counter, wiping it clean, stands Enzo Bianchi. He is a little older, his hair graying at the temples, but his eyes are clear. He is a United States citizen. This cafe is his. He saved his money, he filled out the papers, and he came back, not as a captive, but as a hopeful new American. On the wall, just above the cash register, hangs a single, faded black and white photograph in a simple wooden frame. It shows a group of workers from 1944, all of them dirty, smiling, and squinting into the sun. They are posing proudly under the massive curved hull of a half-finished Liberty ship. In the group, there are 3 Italian men. Enzo, looking young and strong, standing shoulder to shoulder with 4 Rosies, their hair tied up in bandanas. In the center is Maggie, her arms crossed, a rare, wide grin on her face. When new customers sometimes ask about the picture, Enzo just smiles. "That was my first crew," he says, his accent still thick and warm. "They were the ones who taught me how to build." The great ships they built are long gone, scattered across the world's oceans. But the true lasting legacy of that time was not made of steel. It was the quiet human bridge built between enemies, a testament that the most powerful tool of all, stronger than any welder's torch, is the unexpected transformative power of dignity. Thank you for joining us for this lost chapter of history. If you believe these quiet stories of human connection are the ones truly worth telling, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. We would love to read your thoughts. What part of Enzo's and Maggie's story, the propaganda versus the reality, stuck with you the most? Please let us know in the comments below. And finally, if this story about kindness in an unlikely place brightened your day, please share it with someone you think will appreciate it. We'll see you next time.